The sound of splintering wood pierced the afternoon air as the front door exploded inward. 10-year-old Jamal Williams froze at his piano bench, his small fingers still poised over the keys where he'd been practicing Chopin's Minute Waltz. The thunderous crash was followed by shouts, heavy boots, and the metallic clatter of tactical gear. Black-clad figures swarmed through the doorway like a plague of locusts, their weapons drawn, their voices a cacophony of commands that made no sense in the peaceful living room where classical music had been floating just seconds before. "Get down! Get down now!" The words ricocheted off the walls as Jamal's world collapsed into chaos. He couldn't understand why these men were in his house, why they were shouting at him, why their guns were pointed in his direction. All he'd been doing was practicing for next week's school concert, the same way he did every Tuesday afternoon when he got home from school. The boy's instinct was to protect his piano, his most treasured possession, his grandmother's old upright Steinway, the instrument that had taught him to find beauty in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. As the officers rushed toward him, Jamal threw his arms around the piano bench, shielding the keys with his small body. "Don't hurt it, please," he cried, his voice barely audible above the shouting. "It's my grandma's piano." What happened next would haunt the Oakwood neighborhood for years to come. Officer Marcus Reed, a 15-year veteran of the force, grabbed Jamal by the arm and yanked him away from the bench. The force was too much for the child's slight frame. The sickening crack of breaking bone echoed through the room as Jamal's arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The boy's scream cut through the chaos like a blade. It was a sound that would replay in the nightmares of everyone who heard it. A sound that would eventually bring a community together in ways no one could have imagined. 2 hours earlier, Jamal had walked home from Oakwood Elementary School with his backpack bouncing against his shoulders and his head full of musical notes. Tuesday afternoons were his favorite time of the week. His mother, Dr. Angela Williams, worked late at the hospital on Tuesdays, which meant he had the house to himself for practice. No interruptions, no distractions, just him and the piano in perfect harmony. The Williams family had lived on Maple Street for 8 years, ever since Dr. Williams finished her residency and took a position at St. Mary's Hospital. They'd chosen the house specifically because of the large living room with excellent acoustics, perfect for Jamal's musical education. The boy had been playing since he was 4, showing a natural talent that amazed his teachers and filled his mother with pride. Today, like every Tuesday, Jamal had settled at the piano bench at exactly 3:30 p.m. He'd pulled out his sheet music, adjusted the bench height, and begun his warm-up scales. The familiar ritual calmed him, transported him to a place where nothing mattered except the relationship between his fingers and the keys. He'd been working on the Chopin piece for 3 weeks now, preparing for the school's spring concert. Mrs. Patterson, his music teacher, had chosen him as one of only 5 students to perform solo pieces. It was an honor that meant everything to Jamal, whose dreams reached far beyond the small town of Oakwood. He imagined himself someday playing at Carnegie Hall, his mother in the front row, tears of joy streaming down her face. The music flowed from his fingers with increasing confidence. Each run became smoother, each phrase more expressive. He was lost in the world of melody and rhythm when the police arrived. Across the street, Karen Henderson stood at her kitchen window, her phone pressed to her ear and her face twisted with the kind of righteous indignation that had become her trademark in the neighborhood. She'd moved to Maple Street 18 months ago, bringing with her a worldview that saw threats in every shadow and suspicious activity in every unfamiliar sight or sound. "I'm telling you, there's something wrong over there," she hissed into the phone to the 911 dispatcher. "That noise has been going on for almost an hour. It's like someone's banging on something, making all kinds of racket. And it's coming from that black family's house. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Ma'am, can you describe the nature of the noise? Is someone in distress? Karen's eyes narrowed as she peered across the street. Through the Williams' living room window, she could see the silhouette of young Jamal at his piano, his hands moving across the keys with practiced precision. But in Karen's mind, the beautiful music transformed into something sinister, something that confirmed her worst suspicions about her neighbors. It's repetitive banging, like they're, I don't know, building something or dismantling something. And there's only that kid there. No adults around. It could be anything. Drugs, weapons. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You never know with these people. I understand your concern, ma'am. We'll send an officer to check on the situation. But Karen wasn't finished. She'd been building a case against the Williams family in her mind for months, collecting what she saw as evidence of their unworthiness to live in her neighborhood. There was the time Dr. Williams had come home late from the hospital, and her car door had slammed loudly. The morning when Jamal had laughed with his friends while waiting for the school bus, their voices carrying across the quiet street. The Saturday, when they'd had a small barbecue in their backyard, the sound of jazz music drifting over the fence. Officer, I need to stress that this isn't the first time there have been disturbances from this address. There's been loud music, people coming and going at all hours. I'm concerned about what might be going on in there. And with just a child present, she let the implication hang in the air. The dispatcher made notes, and Karen's fabricated concerns began to take on a life of their own in the official record. What started as a noise complaint was transformed into something more urgent, more threatening. The dispatcher's training kicked in, identifying potential keywords and phrases that suggested a higher level of response might be necessary. By the time the call reached Sergeant Davis's desk, it had been coded as a welfare check with possible domestic situation at an address with previous noise complaints. Davis, looking at his deployment board and seeing several units available, made a decision that would change everything. Unit 7, Unit 12, and SWAT 1 respond to 1247 Maple Street for a welfare check. Reports of suspicious activity, possible domestic situation, child may be in danger. The transformation of Karen's call from a simple noise complaint to a SWAT deployment was a perfect storm of miscommunication, assumption, and systemic bias. Each person in the chain of command made small decisions that, when combined, created a response completely disproportionate to the actual situation. Officer Reed and his partner, Officer James Morrison, were the first to arrive. They parked their patrol car 3 houses down, per protocol, and approached the Williams home with caution. Through the living room window, they could see Jamal at the piano, his small form bent in concentration over the keys. That's the suspicious activity, Morrison whispered to his partner. A kid playing piano. Reed shrugged. Dispatch said welfare check, possible domestic. Could be more to it than we can see. They were trained to expect the worst, to prepare for scenarios where split-second decisions could mean the difference between life and death. But here, in this quiet residential neighborhood, watching a 10-year-old boy practice classical music, the full weight of their tactical response seemed absurdly out of place. That's when SWAT arrived. The sound of multiple vehicles screeching to a halt outside sent a chill through the peaceful afternoon. SWAT Commander Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stepped out of the lead vehicle, her team already moving into position around the house. She'd received the call as a Code 3 welfare check, child in potential danger, unknown weapons situation. In her 15 years of tactical operations, Mitchell had seen enough real emergencies to know that time was often the enemy. If a child was truly in danger, Every second of hesitation could be fatal. The decision to breach came quickly, based on the information they'd received and the protocols they'd been trained to follow. "We go in fast and clean," Mitchell told her team. "Secure the child first. Assess the situation. Neutralize any threats." They had no way of knowing that the only threat in the house was the music coming from a 10-year-old boy's piano practice, filtered through the prejudiced perspective of a neighbor who saw danger where none existed. The front door exploded inward with a thunderous crash. The tactical team swept through the house like a flood of black uniforms and shouted commands. In their world of high-stakes operations, the scene before them didn't compute. A child at a piano, sheet music scattered on the bench, the lingering notes of Chopin hanging in the air like an accusation. Jamal's reaction was pure instinct. The piano was his sanctuary, his connection to his grandmother's memory, his pathway to dreams beyond Oakwood. When the officers rushed toward him, every fiber of his being screamed to protect the instrument that meant more to him than his own safety. The crack of his breaking arm seemed to freeze time itself. The shouting stopped. The tactical commands faded. Even the SWAT officers, trained for the most violent scenarios, stood stunned by what had just happened. Jamal's scream echoed through the house and out into the street, where neighbors had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Peterson from next door dropped her gardening gloves and ran toward the sound. Mr. Rodriguez across the street left his car running in the driveway as he hurried to see what was happening. Inside the house, the reality of the situation was beginning to dawn on the officers. They'd responded to a call about suspicious activity and found a child practicing piano. They'd broken down the door of an innocent family's home. And now, that child lay on the floor, crying in pain, his arm bent at an angle that made even the hardened SWAT officers wince. Officer Reed, who had grabbed Jamal's arm, knelt beside the boy, his training kicking in despite his shock. "Call an ambulance," he shouted to his partner. "Now!" Lieutenant Mitchell surveyed the scene with growing horror. The sheet music on the piano bench told the story more clearly than any report could. Chopin's Minute Waltz, annotated in a child's careful handwriting. A practice schedule taped to the wall, showing daily sessions leading up to something called Spring Concert, May 15th. A framed photo of Jamal, with an elderly woman at the same piano, both of them smiling with the kind of joy that only comes from shared love of music. This was no domestic disturbance, no weapons cache, no drug operation. This was a little boy practicing piano in his own home on a Tuesday afternoon, just as he did every week. And they'd broken his arm for it. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes later, its sirens adding to the chaos that had descended on Maple Street. Paramedic Lisa Chen had treated hundreds of children in her 10-year career, but the sight of Jamal Williams lying on his living room floor, surrounded by tactical officers and broken door frames, hit her like a physical blow. "What happened here?" she asked Officer Reed as she knelt beside Jamal, her hands gentle as she assessed his injury. Reed couldn't meet her eyes. "We were responding to a call. There was confusion." Chen looked around the room, taking in the piano, the sheet music, the obvious signs of a musical education in progress. Her own daughter took piano lessons. She knew what this scene should have been: a child learning, growing, expressing himself through art. Instead, it had become something unrecognizable, something that violated every principle she believed in. As she worked to stabilize Jamal's arm, the boy looked up at her with eyes filled with pain and confusion. "Why did they break my piano bench?" he whispered. Chen followed his gaze and saw that the wooden bench had indeed been damaged in the chaos. One of its legs splintered where it had been knocked over during the confrontation. To Jamal, it wasn't just furniture. It was part of his musical world, part of his connection to his grandmother, part of his dreams for the future. "We'll fix it," she promised him, though she wasn't sure how anyone could fix what had happened here. "We'll fix everything." Dr. Angela Williams received the call at 4:47 p.m., just as she was finishing her rounds at St. Mary's Hospital. The voice on the other end belonged to her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, and the words she spoke seemed to come from another universe entirely. "Angela, honey, you need to come home right now. There's been an incident. Jamal. He's okay, but he's hurt. The police. There was some kind of mistake." The 15-minute drive from the hospital to Maple Street passed in a blur of traffic lights and racing thoughts. Dr. Williams had seen enough emergency situations in her medical career to know that "he's okay, but he's hurt" could mean almost anything. But nothing could have prepared her for the scene that greeted her when she turned onto her street. 3 police cars, an ambulance with its lights still flashing, SWAT vehicles parked at angles that suggested urgency and chaos, her front door hanging off its hinges like a broken tooth, and neighbors standing in small clusters, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. She found Jamal in the ambulance, his left arm immobilized in a temporary splint, his face streaked with tears, but his eyes alert and focused on her arrival. The relief in his expression nearly broke her heart. "Mama," he said, his voice small but steady. "They broke the door, and they broke my arm, but I was just practicing for the concert." Dr. Williams climbed into the ambulance beside her son, her medical training warring with her maternal instincts. She could see that the break was clean, likely requiring surgery, but not life-threatening. She could assess the situation with professional detachment. But as she held Jamal's good hand in hers, the reality of what had happened crashed over her like a tidal wave. Someone had called the police on her son for practicing piano in his own home. The response had been so disproportionate, so aggressive, that it had resulted in serious injury to a 10-year-old child whose only crime was loving music. Lieutenant Mitchell approached the ambulance with the kind of careful dignity that comes from years of delivering difficult news to families. She'd been dreading this conversation from the moment she realized the true nature of their emergency response. "Dr. Williams, I'm Lieutenant Mitchell with the SWAT team. I want to apologize for what happened here today. There was clearly a miscommunication in the dispatch process, and we responded with inappropriate force to what was obviously a non-threatening situation." Dr. Williams looked at the lieutenant with the controlled calm of someone accustomed to crisis management. "A miscommunication. My son is going to need surgery because of your miscommunication. My front door is in pieces because of your miscommunication. And all of this happened because he was practicing piano in our living room on a Tuesday afternoon." The weight of those words settled over everyone within hearing distance. Mitchell had commanded SWAT operations in genuine emergency situations, had saved lives, and protected communities from real threats. But here, she'd authorized the use of tactical force against a child making music. The irony was bitter and inescapable. "Ma'am, I understand your anger, and you have every right to it. We're going to conduct a full investigation into how this happened, and we'll make sure it never happens again." But Dr. Williams was already focused on her son's immediate needs. The conversation about accountability and justice would come later, when Jamal was safe and healing. For now, she had to be his mother first and everything else second. As the ambulance pulled away from Maple Street, heading toward the same hospital where Dr. Williams spent her days saving lives. The neighborhood began to process what they'd witnessed. Mrs. Peterson stood in her yard, still wearing the gardening gloves she'd abandoned when she heard Jamal scream. Mr. Rodriguez watched from his driveway, his own children visible through his living room window, safe and unharmed, but somehow changed by what they'd seen. And across the street, Karen Henderson stood at her window, watching the aftermath of her phone call with an expression that was difficult to read. She'd gotten what she wanted, attention for the disturbance from the Williams house. But as she watched the ambulance disappear around the corner, carrying a broken 10-year-old boy to the hospital, even she seemed to grasp the magnitude of what her false emergency call had set in motion. The story might have ended there, with a family traumatized, a community shocked, and a system that had failed to protect an innocent child. But in the age of social media and citizen journalism, stories like this rarely stay hidden for long. Marcus Thompson had been walking his dog past the Williams house when the SWAT team arrived. A freelance journalist who'd recently moved to Oakwood, Thompson had covered enough police incidents to recognize when something didn't add up. The massive response, the tactical gear, the broken door, all for what appeared to be a quiet residential address with no signs of criminal activity. Thompson had started recording on his phone the moment he saw the SWAT vehicles. He captured the sound of the door being breached, the shouting of commands, and, most importantly, the moment when Jamal's scream cut through the afternoon air. He'd also recorded the conversations between neighbors, the arrival of the ambulance, and the obvious confusion of officers who were clearly grappling with the realization that they'd made a terrible mistake. But what Thompson had discovered in his initial investigation was even more damning than the incident itself. Karen Henderson hadn't just made a single false emergency call. She'd been systematically harassing the Williams family for months, documenting what she considered suspicious activities, and building a case that painted them as undesirable neighbors. Thompson found evidence of multiple complaints Karen had made to the Homeowners Association about excessive noise from the Williams house, noise that, upon investigation, turned out to be Jamal's daily piano practice and occasional family gatherings. She'd taken photos of Dr. Williams's car parked in her own driveway, claiming it blocked sightlines and created security concerns. She'd even filed a complaint with the city about the jazz music that drifted from their backyard during a small barbecue, arguing that it violated noise ordinances. Each complaint individually might have seemed like the actions of an overly sensitive neighbor, but taken together, they painted a picture of sustained harassment based on racial prejudice. Karen had been trying to force the Williams family out of the neighborhood, and when her previous tactics failed, she'd escalated to calling 911 with false emergency claims. Thompson's investigation revealed something else that would prove crucial in the days to come. Karen had been live streaming on a neighborhood watch app when she made the 911 call. The stream, which she'd apparently forgotten to turn off, captured her real thoughts about the Williams family in ways that went far beyond what she'd told the dispatcher. "I don't know why they moved to this neighborhood," Karen's voice could be heard saying on the recording. "These people just don't fit in here. They're probably doing drugs, dealing weapons, who knows what else. That noise could be a cover for anything. I'm going to make sure the police take this seriously." The recording also captured her coaching herself on what to say to the 911 operator, deliberately choosing words like suspicious, banging, and no adults present to create a sense of urgency and danger where none existed. It was premeditated deception designed to trigger the maximum police response possible. When Thompson published his first article about the incident on his blog, including excerpts from the livestream recording, the story exploded across social media with the force of a social justice earthquake. The image of 10-year-old Jamal Williams, his arm in a cast, but still reaching toward piano keys in a hospital bed photo, became a symbol of everything wrong with systemic racism and police overreach. The hashtag, Jamal just wanted to play, began trending within hours, accompanied by videos of children playing piano, stories of similar incidents across the country, and calls for justice that reached far beyond the borders of Oakwood. Musicians from around the world began sharing the story, some creating tribute performances of the Chopin piece Jamal had been practicing when his world was shattered. But the story took on even greater significance when the full context of Karen's harassment campaign became public. This wasn't just about a single false emergency call. It was about a sustained effort to weaponize law enforcement against a black family who had committed no crime other than existing in a neighborhood where someone decided they didn't belong. Dr. Williams, despite her own trauma and her focus on Jamal's recovery, found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as the story gained national attention. She'd never wanted to be an activist or a symbol. She'd simply wanted to raise her son in a safe community where he could pursue his dreams. But as she sat in Jamal's hospital room, fielding calls from reporters and civil rights organizations, she began to understand that her family's story was bigger than their individual experience. "Mama," Jamal said from his hospital bed, his casted arm resting on a pillow, while his good hand picked out melodies on a small electronic keyboard that one of his teachers had brought to the hospital. "Why did that lady call the police on my piano playing?" It was the question that Dr. Williams had been dreading, because the honest answer was too complex and too painful for a 10-year-old to fully understand. How do you explain to a child that his love of music had been perceived as a threat? How do you tell him that his skin color had transformed his innocent practice session into something sinister in the mind of a prejudiced neighbor? Sometimes, baby, people make mistakes about other people. They see things that aren't really there, or they let their fears make them act in ways that hurt others. That lady made a very big mistake, and now everyone is working to make sure it doesn't happen again. Jamal considered this with the seriousness that seemed to characterize all his thoughts. Will I still be able to play in the spring concert? The concert was still 3 weeks away. Jamal's arm would be in a cast for at least 6 weeks, possibly longer, depending on how the surgery went. The logical answer was no. He wouldn't be able to perform. But looking at her son's hopeful expression, Dr. Williams found herself making a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "We're going to do everything we can to make that happen, sweetheart. Everything we can." The community response to Jamal's story was swift and overwhelming. By the weekend following the incident, the Williams yard was filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from neighbors and strangers alike. Someone had repaired their front door, painting it a cheerful blue and adding new hardware that was stronger than what had been destroyed. Others had contributed to a fund to help with medical expenses and to repair Jamal's piano bench, which local woodworkers had restored to even better condition than before. But the most meaningful response came from the music community. Mrs. Patterson, Jamal's music teacher, arrived at the hospital with a proposal that would change everything. "Jamal," she said, settling into the chair beside his bed, "I've been thinking about the spring concert. You've worked so hard on that Chopin piece, and it would be a shame for all that practice to go to waste." The boy's face fell slightly. "I can't play with one hand." "What if I told you there are beautiful pieces written specifically for one hand? What if we could adapt your performance so you could still be part of the concert?" Mrs. Patterson pulled out sheet music for several pieces composed for left hand only, including works by Ravel and Scriabin. They were challenging pieces, requiring skill and artistry, but perfectly suited for a pianist with Jamal's talent and determination. "Would you be willing to learn something new?" she asked. Jamal's eyes lit up with the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him since the incident. "Can we start now?" The image of Jamal learning to play one-handed pieces in his hospital bed became another viral moment. But this time, it represented resilience and hope rather than injustice and trauma. Videos of him practicing on his small electronic keyboard, his left hand dancing across the keys while his right arm rested in its cast, inspired musicians and non-musicians alike. Meanwhile, the legal and political consequences of the incident were beginning to unfold. The district attorney's office announced they would be investigating both the police response and Karen Henderson's false emergency call. The SWAT deployment was suspended pending review, and Officer Reed, who had grabbed Jamal's arm, was placed on administrative leave while the internal investigation continued. But the community wanted more than investigations and administrative actions. They wanted accountability, justice, and assurance that nothing like this could ever happen again. A group of neighbors, led by Mrs. Peterson and Mr. Rodriguez, organized what they called Music on Maple Street, a community concert to be held on the Saturday before Jamal's scheduled spring concert performance. The event was designed to celebrate music, support the Williams family, and make a clear statement about the values of their neighborhood. Local musicians volunteered to perform. Families contributed food and decorations, and the elementary school offered to provide sound equipment and staging. As word of the concert spread, it grew beyond a simple neighborhood gathering into something approaching a movement. Professional musicians from the symphony offered to participate. Local news stations planned coverage. Civil rights organizations announced their support. What had started as a gesture of community solidarity had become a symbol of resistance against prejudice and a celebration of the diversity that makes neighborhoods stronger. But not everyone in Oakwood supported the growing attention and activism surrounding Jamal's story. Karen Henderson, whose role in triggering the incident had become public knowledge, found herself increasingly isolated as her neighbors learned the truth about her sustained harassment of the Williams family. The livestream recording had been devastating to her reputation. Hearing her actual words, her deliberate deception, and her openly prejudiced assumptions about her black neighbors had shocked even those who might have been sympathetic to concerns about noise or neighborhood disruptions. This wasn't about legitimate complaints. It was about racism, plain and simple. Karen's employer, a local real estate company, terminated her employment after the recording went viral. Her homeowners association announced they would be reviewing her multiple complaints about the Williams family in light of the new evidence of harassment, and several neighbors who had previously been neutral in community disputes began to speak publicly about their own uncomfortable interactions with Karen. The isolation and consequences seemed to push Karen toward even more desperate behavior. Instead of acknowledging her role in the incident and seeking to make amends, she began portraying herself as the victim of a politically correct mob that was destroying her life over a simple noise complaint. She created her own social media accounts to share her side of the story, painting Dr. Williams and Jamal as hostile neighbors who had somehow orchestrated a media campaign against her. She claimed that the piano playing had been deliberately loud and disruptive, and that she had every right to call police about suspicious activity in her neighborhood. But Karen's attempts to control the narrative only made things worse. Her social media posts revealed the depth of her prejudice and her complete lack of remorse for the harm she'd caused. When confronted with the fact that she'd called 911 on a child practicing piano, she doubled down, arguing that you never know what these people are really doing, and that the police response was appropriate based on the information available. The posts were screenshot and shared widely, providing even more evidence of the mindset that had led to Jamal's injury. They also caught the attention of the district attorney's office, which was building its case for filing charges related to false emergency reporting and harassment. As the date for Music on Maple Street approached, the neighborhood began to transform. Families hung colorful banners supporting Jamal and celebrating music. Local businesses donated supplies and services for the concert. The elementary school students created artwork featuring musical instruments and messages of hope. Even the city council, responding to public pressure, announced they would be reviewing their emergency response protocols to prevent similar incidents in the future. Jamal, meanwhile, was making remarkable progress in his recovery and his musical adaptation. The one-handed pieces Mrs. Patterson had introduced him to were challenging in new ways, requiring him to think about music differently and to develop techniques he'd never needed before. But his natural talent and determination, combined with the outpouring of support from his community, seemed to fuel his rehabilitation. Dr. Williams watched her son's resilience with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. He shouldn't have had to learn these lessons about prejudice and injustice at such a young age. He shouldn't have had to adapt his musical dreams because someone else's hatred had broken his arm. But watching him practice those one-handed pieces with the same joy and dedication he'd always brought to music, she began to see something powerful emerging from the tragedy. Her son wasn't just healing from his physical injury. He was becoming a symbol of how beauty and art can survive and even thrive in the face of hatred and ignorance. His music was more than entertainment now. It was resistance, resilience, and hope made audible. The morning of Music on Maple Street dawned clear and warm. Perfect weather for the outdoor concert that had grown far beyond anyone's original vision. What had started as a neighborhood gathering now filled the entire street and the adjacent park, with professional sound equipment, media coverage, and an audience that included people who had traveled from across the state to show their support. Jamal sat in his wheelchair at the side of the makeshift stage, his cast decorated with signatures and musical notes from well-wishers, watching as performer after performer took the stage to play pieces that ranged from classical to jazz to contemporary. Each performance was dedicated to him, to the power of music to heal and unite, and to the principle that no child should ever face violence for pursuing their dreams. The highlight of the concert came when renowned pianist Maria Castellanos, who had flown in from New York specifically for the event, performed Ravel's Piano Concerto for the left hand, the same piece Jamal had been learning for his upcoming school concert. As her left hand danced across the keys with breathtaking skill and emotion, Jamal watched with rapt attention, understanding for the first time the full potential of the music he was learning to play. When Castellanos finished her performance, she called Jamal onto the stage. With the help of his physical therapist, he walked carefully to the piano, settled onto the bench, and placed his left hand on the keys. The opening notes of Scriabin's Nocturne for the left hand floated across the silent crowd. Jamal's technique wasn't perfect yet, his hand still adjusting to carrying the full weight of the musical expression. But the emotion in his playing, the courage it represented, and the beauty that emerged from what should have been limitation, created a moment that transcended technical perfection. As the last notes faded, the crowd rose in a standing ovation that seemed to last forever. But for Jamal, the most meaningful response came from his mother, who had tears streaming down her face as she applauded her son's incredible journey from victim to victor. The success of Music on Maple Street marked a turning point, not just for Jamal and his family, but for the broader community's understanding of what had happened and what it meant. The incident could no longer be dismissed as a simple misunderstanding or communication error. It had been a deliberate attack on a family, motivated by racial prejudice and enabled by a system that had failed to question the assumptions underlying Karen Henderson's emergency call. 3 days after the concert, the district attorney announced that Karen Henderson would be charged with filing a false police report, harassment, and misuse of emergency services. The charges carried potential jail time and significant fines. But more importantly, they sent a message that weaponizing law enforcement against innocent neighbors would have serious consequences. The police department also announced major changes to their emergency response protocols. All officers would receive additional training on implicit bias and de-escalation techniques. Emergency dispatchers would be required to ask more detailed questions before authorizing SWAT deployments. And a new civilian oversight board would review all cases involving use of force against minors. Officer Reed, who had grabbed Jamal's arm, faced departmental charges and was ultimately suspended without pay for 6 months. While he would eventually return to duty, his career was permanently marked by his role in the incident. In a statement released through his attorney, Reed expressed remorse for his actions and announced he would be making a personal donation to Jamal's medical fund. But the most significant change was happening at the community level. The neighbors of Maple Street had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice and privilege, about the assumptions they made and the silence they maintained in the face of injustice. The incident had held up a mirror to their community, and many didn't like what they saw. The response was a grassroots effort to build a more inclusive, supportive neighborhood. Families began organizing regular potluck dinners, cultural exchange events, and community improvement projects. The elementary school started a diversity and inclusion program, bringing in speakers to help children understand and celebrate differences. And several neighbors, inspired by Jamal's example, began taking music lessons themselves. Mrs. Peterson, who had been among the first to respond when she heard Jamal scream, became an unofficial leader of the community transformation. She organized workshops on recognizing and interrupting racism, helped establish a neighborhood support network for families facing discrimination, and worked with local schools to ensure that all children felt safe and valued. "We can't change what happened to Jamal," she said at one of the community meetings. "But we can make sure that our response honors his courage and protects all our children. We can build the kind of neighborhood where every child's dreams are supported, not shattered." As Jamal's spring concert date approached, the anticipation throughout Oakwood was palpable. The elementary school had to move the event to the high school auditorium to accommodate all the people who wanted to attend. Media outlets had requested permission to cover the performance, and musicians from around the country had sent messages of support and encouragement. But for Jamal, the concert had become about more than just performing music. It represented his refusal to let trauma define him, his determination to continue pursuing his dreams despite the obstacles others had placed in his path. Every hour of practice with his left hand had been an act of resistance against those who had tried to silence his music. The night of the concert, Jamal stood backstage in his best suit, his right arm still in a cast, but decorated now with colorful artwork and encouraging messages from classmates and supporters. His left hand was warm and flexible from practice, ready to carry the full weight of his musical expression. "Are you nervous, Mrs.?" Patterson asked him as they listened to the murmur of the large crowd gathering in the auditorium. Jamal considered the question seriously, as he did most things. "A little," he admitted, "but mostly I'm excited. I want everyone to hear that they couldn't stop my music." When his turn came to perform, Jamal walked onto the stage with quiet dignity. The auditorium fell completely silent as he settled at the piano bench and positioned his left hand over the keys. For a moment, he looked out at the crowd, seeing his mother in the front row, his neighbors and classmates, and hundreds of strangers who had been touched by his story. Then he began to play. The piece he had chosen was Scriabin's Prelude for the Left Hand, a composition that seemed to capture both melancholy and hope in its flowing melody. Jamal's technique had improved dramatically in the weeks since Music on Maple Street, and his emotional connection to the music had deepened through his experience of trauma and recovery. As his left hand moved across the keys with increasing confidence and expression, the audience seemed to hold its collective breath. This wasn't just a musical performance. It was a testament to the human spirit's ability to find beauty and meaning in the face of adversity. Every note was a declaration that hatred had not won, that prejudice had not silenced his voice, that a 10-year-old boy's love of music was stronger than all the forces that had tried to destroy it. When the last note faded, the auditorium erupted in applause that seemed to go on forever. Jamal stood and took his bow, his face glowing with the satisfaction of having shared his gift with the world despite everything that had been done to stop him. But the evening's surprises weren't over. As the applause finally began to die down, Mrs. Patterson returned to the stage with a special announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium, "we have one more very special performance tonight. Please welcome back to the stage Jamal Williams, joined by renowned pianist Maria Castellanos, for a duet version of Mozart's Sonata for Four Hands, adapted for three hands." The arrangement was something Castellanos and Mrs. Patterson had been working on in secret for weeks, a way for Jamal to experience the joy of collaborative music making, even with his physical limitations. As the two pianists sat side by side at the grand piano, Castellanos' two hands and Jamal's left hand working together to create Mozart's intricate harmonies, the audience witnessed something truly magical. The music that emerged from their collaboration was more than the sum of its parts. It represented the power of community support, the beauty that can emerge from adaptation and resilience, and the triumph of artistic expression over those who would seek to silence it. When the duet ended, Castellanos turned to Jamal and said, loud enough for the audience to hear, "Thank you for reminding all of us why we make music. Your courage and talent inspire musicians around the world." The standing ovation that followed seemed to lift the roof of the auditorium. People were crying, cheering, and celebrating not just Jamal's musical achievement, but everything his journey had represented for their community and beyond. In the weeks that followed the concert, Jamal's story continued to ripple outward, inspiring changes in communities across the country. Other neighborhoods began examining their own biases and working to create more inclusive environments. Police departments reviewed their emergency response protocols. Schools developed programs to teach children about the dangers of prejudice and the importance of standing up for one another. Karen Henderson, meanwhile, faced the consequences of her actions in both the legal system and the court of public opinion. Her trial for filing false police reports became a national news story, highlighting the serious harm that can result from weaponizing law enforcement against innocent neighbors. She was ultimately sentenced to 6 months in jail, 2 years of probation, and community service specifically focused on diversity and inclusion education. More importantly, her case became a precedent for holding people accountable for making false emergency calls motivated by racial bias. Prosecutors in other jurisdictions began pursuing similar charges in comparable cases, sending a clear message that this behavior would no longer be tolerated. But the most lasting impact of the incident was the transformation it sparked in Jamal himself and in the community around him. The boy who had been traumatized by prejudice and violence had become a symbol of resilience and hope. His music, which had been seen as threatening by one hateful neighbor, was now recognized as a gift that could heal and unite people across racial and cultural divides. As Jamal's arm healed, and he gradually regained the use of both hands, he continued to perform the one-handed pieces he had learned during his recovery. They had become part of his repertoire, a reminder of what he had overcome, and a testament to the power of adaptation and determination. Dr. Williams watched her son's continued growth with amazement and pride. The trauma he had experienced would always be part of his story, but it hadn't broken him. Instead, it had revealed strength and courage she hadn't even known he possessed. It had also brought their community together in ways that might never have happened otherwise, creating bonds of understanding and support that would benefit all the neighborhood's children for years to come. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, 6 months after the incident that had changed everything, Jamal sat at his piano in the living room of their repaired home on Maple Street. The front door, painted a cheerful blue by caring neighbors, was open to let in the spring breeze. The piano bench, restored to beautiful condition by local craftsmen, supported him as he practiced a new piece for his summer recital. Both of his hands moved across the keys now, his right arm fully healed and strong again. But he still played the one-handed pieces he had learned during his recovery, finding in them a depth of expression that connected him to the most challenging period of his young life and to the community of people who had supported him through it. As the music filled the house and drifted out into the neighborhood, it carried with it all the lessons learned and changes made in the months since a hateful phone call had tried to silence it forever. The melody was the same as it had always been, but its meaning had been transformed. It was no longer just the sound of a child learning and growing. It was the anthem of a community that had chosen love over hate, inclusion over prejudice, and music over silence. Mrs. Peterson, working in her garden next door, smiled as she heard the familiar strains of Jamal's practice session. Mr. Rodriguez, arriving home from work, paused in his driveway to listen to the beautiful music that had become the soundtrack of their transformed neighborhood. And all along Maple Street, in houses where families of different races, cultures, and backgrounds now gathered regularly for potluck dinners and community celebrations. The sound of Jamal's piano was a reminder of how much they had all learned and how far they had all come. The music played on, resilient and beautiful, a testament to the truth that hatred may wound, but it cannot destroy the human capacity for art, love, and hope. In learning to make music with one hand, Jamal had taught an entire community how to build bridges with open hearts. His story would continue to inspire others long after the last note of his Tuesday afternoon practice session faded into the peaceful air of a neighborhood that had been transformed by the courage of a 10-year-old boy who just wanted to play piano. And in the end, that's exactly what he did. He played, and the world listened, and everything was changed forever by the simple, powerful act of making music in the face of those who would silence it. The piano continued to sing, as it always had, as it always would, carrying Jamal's dreams and his community's hopes into a future bright with possibility and harmony.